MSSO webinar, What is MedDRA and how is it used? My name is Suzanne Nsour Shaker, or Shaker, both pronunciations are correct. I'll be your instructor for this webinar. Joining me is my colleague, Hannah Eaton. Hannah is a training coordinator with the MSSO, and she will kindly facilitate our session for today. So I'll start with some introductions. I'm currently a medical officer with the MSSO. Prior to that, I had a little over 20 years experience in the industry in the world of clinical research as part of different functional teams, including data management, clinical monitoring, pharmacovigilance and medical data safety, as well as medical data science, and of course, medical coding with MedDRA and WhoDrug. I always like to start by getting to know you a little bit more. So at this time, I invite you to connect via the QR code on your screen. And we're just going to be asking you 3 questions. Where are you calling from, your level of familiarity with MedDRA, and the role or roles you perform in your organization. If the tool asks for a username, you can simply skip that part or just enter MedDRA with 2 Ds, 1, 2, 3. All right, so I see the pins start to come in, and a few housekeeping items as the pins are being added to the map. This webinar is scheduled for 2 hours. We are here to answer questions, so we will open it up for Q&A at the end. But if you think of any questions as we go through the slides, please post them in the chat. Hannah will be checking for questions as we go along, and we will address them as we go through the slides. If you think of any questions afterwards, or if your question isn't fully addressed to your satisfaction, you can always reach out to our help desk anytime. Our team will be very happy to assist you. And I'm very happy to see pins from different parts of the world coming in. It's always wonderful to see this slide. It may be a testament how global MedDRA is. Right now, MedDRA is available in 27 languages, and we expect even more to come. I do want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today, whether it's late in the day or early in the day for you. I do appreciate your taking the time. So welcome, everyone. And although more folks are still adding pins, I do think for the interest of time, maybe we want to keep moving. So let's move on and ask our second question. What is your level of familiarity with MedDRA? So the theme for this webinar is a general overview. So I do expect we will have folks that are not familiar with MedDRA on the call. And since we have a general overview today, we will not be going into too many details on coding with MedDRA and data analysis with MedDRA. For those of you who are interested in additional training, we do offer webinars targeted to those specific areas. In fact, I'll be presenting a webinar on MedDRA coding basics on the 22nd of January. And if you go to the meddra.org website and you click on the calendar icon on the top right corner, it will take you to our webinar offerings. And you can find the topics that you're interested in. You can filter by the topic or by the language and pick the ones that best fit your schedule and your interest. You can also watch our recorded sessions on our YouTube channel. All right, so as expected, most folks joining us today are not familiar with MedDRA, which works very well for this webinar. So let's ask a third question. What primary role or roles do you perform in your organization? And I really like this slide because it gives me a sense of who's on the call and how familiar they may be in the industry and in MedDRA roles in the industry. And you can pick as many as apply to you, not even necessarily in your current role, even in previous lives, if you like. And I think it's interesting also to see how MedDRA plays a part in the activities of different teams and functionalities. So it really shows how adaptable MedDRA can be. I do hope you come away from today's session with the takeaway that MedDRA is a tool available to you to be leveraged to best assist you with your different roles and operations. So we can see it's a wide representation of the industry, so I'm very happy to see that. And as usual, most folks come from the pharmacovigilance and drug device safety background. So welcome everyone. All right, next is our disclaimer and copyright notice. Just like MedDRA is owned by the ICH, the slides that we are presenting today are also owned and copyright protected to the ICH. But with the exception of the ICH and MedDRA logos, you can use the material we are presenting. But if you make any changes, translations, modifications, please ensure that you demarcate the edits you make and avoid any inference that your changes were endorsed by the ICH. The second bullet point is the disclaimer that the presentation is provided as is without warranty. The third bullet point talks about third-party material, which we don't have today, so it doesn't apply. So our overview today will cover the origins of MedDRA, its background, its governance, as well as the scope, structure, and characteristics of MedDRA. We'll describe how it's maintained. We'll describe some MSSO tools. We'll touch briefly on principles of coding with MedDRA and introduce you to the ICH-endorsed guidelines points to consider documents. We'll explain what standardized MedDRA queries are, and then we'll wrap up with a question and answer session. So let's get started with the MedDRA background. And I like to tell this story every time. The first time I prepared for this particular presentation, I happened to catch an online class by a political science professor from Texas. He was presenting on a historical event, and he said he learned in his experience, when you tell a story, you should never start from the beginning. You have to start from way before the beginning. And I'm sure many of you already know that MedDRA started in the 1990s, but to take you back to the origins of MedDRA, it always makes sense to me to start with the origins of the ICH, who created MedDRA and who owned MedDRA. And if you go to the meddra.org website, and let me just see if I can take you there. The first link on the top right-hand corner of the website, you'll see the ICH logo. And that takes you to the ICH page. And they have a nice section that talks about ICH and with an outline of the ICH history. And in it, they talk about the need to harmonize. This basically summarizes how different regions of the world varied historically on how they came to the realization that it was important to have an independent evaluation of medicinal products before they are allowed on the market. And that in many cases, this realization sadly was driven by tragedies, like the tragic story of thalidomide that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. So the period that thalidomide story happened in was the 1950s. This was a period of scientific progress and economic reconstruction after World War II, which fueled unprecedented growth in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical companies were increasingly operating across international borders. However, regulatory oversight remained national. It was not keeping pace with this progress, so it was underdeveloped with minimal barriers to international drug marketing. New drugs were assumed safe unless proven otherwise, and they didn't yet have formalized concepts of pharmacovigilance and risk-benefit assessments the way we do today. There were no standardized requirements for preclinical testing, no mandatory controls for clinical trials, no structured systems for reporting adverse events, and not a lot of communication between regulators across different regions of the world. In that backdrop, our story starts. And I'm taking you back specifically to a single day. On 25 December 1954, a baby was born in Europe with congenital deformities. The baby was born to an employee who worked at a manufacturer facility who had been taking samples of a new analgesic drug they called a miracle drug. Her company was working on this medication, and it was helping in her morning sickness. And although the baby was born with marked deformities, sadly, these were not linked to the new experimental medication that the mom had taken. Some sources believe this particular baby was the first thalidomide baby. I'm sure many of you, like I said, are familiar with that story. But even after the birth of this employee baby, the new drug continued its development. It got approval. It was marketed 2 years later in 1956 and advertised as a safe medication and even sold over the counter. And then it was picked up by other pharmaceutical companies. So the story got worse, and it was used around the world and marketed under different manufacturers and sold under different trade names for another 4 or 5 years before anybody started reporting the dangers of using it. By the time this drug was withdrawn from the market in 1961, it had been sold by up to at least 14 different pharmaceutical companies in as many as 46 countries under at least 37 different trade names. And even then, it stayed in many medicinal cabinets in people's homes, and it wasn't withdrawn from all markets at the same time. And I wanted to show you kind of what thalidomide did to the very important population of babies. So I pulled up a stock image for thalidomide babies, and you can see the side effects it had on them. So there was many heartbreaking layers to this story. There was lack of sufficient testing before approval, lack of communication and data sharing between organizations and regions, lack of adequate reporting, and of course the impacted population was the most vulnerable, the unborn babies. The effect on them, as you can see, was really horrific and permanent. They had a wide range of different types of congenital deformities. The most obvious one that you can see are the impact to the arms and the legs, to the limbs, but there were also impacts to congenital deformities to the eyes, to the ears, and internally as well, like the cardiac system, the uterine system, the renal system, the nervous system. There were also intrauterine deaths and early infancy deaths. The scope of impact was huge. We don't know how many were truly affected, but there are estimates. Some folks believe there were 2,000 deaths. Some folks believe there were 10,000 up to 20,000 birth defects. And some estimates say there were up to 100,000 impacted victims, some still alive today. These are all estimates, as there was no way to track all those who were exposed to the drug and follow them. And there were, of course, intrauterine deaths and stillbirths that have not been linked to the medication. And this was a time when there was stigma about birth defects. So that also led to some cases not being reported. Tragic as it was, this sad story of thalidomide led to the realization that we need regulatory oversight. So the 1960s and 70s saw a rapid increase in laws, regulations, and guidelines for reporting and evaluating the data on new medicinal products. But at the same time, this complicated practical and financial matters on the side of the manufacturers. They found themselves trying to comply with different and sometimes divergent technical requirements as they tried to duplicate time-consuming and expensive procedures in order to market their products internationally. That escalated the R&D costs, healthcare costs. It restricted availability of new medicines to those in need. And that's where the need to rationalize and harmonize regulations became great. And harmonization was proven successful as pioneered by the EC in Europe in the 1980s. They were able to develop a single market for pharmaceuticals. And there were discussions between Europe, Japan, and the US on possibilities for harmonization. So the ICH was conceived and born in 1990 at a meeting in Brussels. It had representatives of the regulatory agencies and industry associations in those three regions, Europe, the US, and Japan. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ICH work products. So they introduced guidelines in 4 main areas: quality guidelines, efficacy guidelines, and safety guidelines. And of course, many of you use them in your day-to-day activities, like, for example, good manufacturing practice, quality risk management, efficacy guidelines good clinical practice, the GCP guideline. The E2 guidelines for pharmacovigilance are among these. So you'll see the E2B R3 guidelines or the E2C guidelines for the periodic benefit risk evaluation report. All of these are ICH guidelines. But ICH also identified early on that for the harmonization effort to be successful, they had to be able to easily communicate with each other and be able to compare each other's data across different regions, across different indications, different product types, and across time. And that's where the idea for MedDRA was born, as a standardized language to communicate data. So they created a working group and a standard was decided upon to get started, and that became the multidisciplinary guideline M1. So if you click on M1 in the ICH website, you'll see MedDRA is listed there. And of course, it'll show the implementation status of MedDRA in the different regions of the world. And it will also give you a link back to the MedDRA website. I know it's a kind of a long introduction, but I always like to give the story to give you a backdrop of MedDRA and how MedDRA was started. It also kind of introduces us to this next slide that MedDRA was developed under the auspices of the ICH. The activities of my team, the MSSO, the MedDRA Maintenance and Support Services Organization, is overseen by the ICH MedDRA Steering Committee. That committee is composed of different colleagues coming from both the regulatory background and the industry background from different regions of the world. It also has WHO as observer. And since 2025, they expanded the group to have representatives from even China and the Saudi Arabia as well. So what is MedDRA? MedDRA is an acronym which stands for Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. But MedDRA is not a dictionary in the normal sense of the word dictionary with definitions. MedDRA is more a collection of dictions. Dictions are choices and uses of words and phrases in speech or writing. So the purpose of MedDRA is to standardize, summarize, and analyze data. So MedDRA is a collection of different dictions, different texts that convey words and phrases used to represent medical concepts. So when you're coding in MedDRA, what you're doing is you're selecting a diction or a text or a term that already exists in MedDRA that best represents the medical concept you're trying to code, your original source term, your verbatim that you received in its natural language. And there could be more than one term in MedDRA that is suitable for you. They are considered sibling terms or sister terms that mean the same concept. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the hierarchy of MedDRA. So for example, if you want to say abdominal pain or belly ache or abdominal cramp, these are all sister terms in MedDRA, and they represent the same main medical concept. So MedDRA is clinically validated, meaning that MedDRA will not change unless that change is reviewed and validated and approved by the medical officers that control MedDRA, that they have to review any changes that are requested and approve them if they are truly representative of valid medical concepts. And they can be international medical terminologies, because from different parts of the world you can request additions or changes to MedDRA. It is used by the regulatory authorities and the regulated biopharmaceutical industry throughout the regulatory process. And of course, its intended use is for data entry, retrieval, evaluation, and presentation. So the main focus of MedDRA, like we said, is standardization. It's a really important tool when you're evaluating products and product safety, when you're conducting your monitoring activities, when you're communicating data and sharing electronic records and performing oversight activities. So it not only supports the data entry, which we call coding, but also retrieval and analysis, regardless of the type of product. So it's not just pharmaceutical products, but also can be used for biologics, vaccines, drug device combination products, even food products, even makeup products, cosmetics, and devices. So the governance of MedDRA falls under the MedDRA Steering Committee. That committee is appointed by the ICH Assembly, and it provides oversight of MedDRA activities as performed by the MSSO team, because ultimately ICH are the ones who own MedDRA, while the MSSO are the guardians of MedDRA. So ICH has oversight of all operations of the MSSO, and there are regular meetings between them. The ICH MedDRA Steering Committee is the one who sets the subscription rates and approves developmental plans taken on by the MSSO. We do have a sister organization to the MSSO called the JMO for the Japanese language MedDRA, because when the MedDRA terminology was created, it was created under two main languages that started in English and Japanese. Of course, now we have up to 27 languages, but the JMO team is the sister partner of the MSSO, who oversight the Japanese language for MedDRA. And they perform the same kind of activities that the MSSO does in terms of custodian oversight and training, just like this webinar that we have today. The MedDRA terminology applies to all phases of development of medical products for human use. The only exclusion is animal toxicology. But the terminology was developed for regulators and the regulated medical product industry in both pre- and post-marketing phases of the regulatory process. So it's used in clinical studies, in spontaneous adverse reactions and events, in regulatory submissions, and the regulated product information. And examples of documents you'll see MedDRA cited are the ICSRs, the clinical study reports, the brochures, in compiling the company's core safety information, in publications, in prescribing information, and for countries that allow direct-to-consumer advertising, those commercials for drugs that list possible side effects are using MedDRA terminology. So let's talk a little bit about how MedDRA is built, its scope and structure. The terms that you see outside of the blue circle are outside of the scope of MedDRA. And when you think of what's outside the scope of MedDRA from the perspective of data collection design, they tend to be data that is already intended for specific fields of their own, where they can be standardized and summarized without the need for MedDRA. So for example, the type of clinical trial design, whether it's double-blind, single-blind, if any cohorts exist, that doesn't need to be in MedDRA. Patient demographics, ages of patients, genders, ethnicities, these are all outside the scope of MedDRA. Of course, there could be exclusions, like some age groupings are relevant in MedDRA if you think, for example, neonatal or elderly conditions. Some gender qualifiers are relevant if you think, for example, male versus female breast cancer. Those would be relevant to differentiate from a medical perspective. Other example of items outside of the scope of MedDRA are frequency qualifiers. Like you're not going to see something where they had headache 12 times. They had a frequent occurrence of this particular condition or rare occurrence of this particular concept. But there are a few also exceptions, like you might find the qualifier intermittent available in MedDRA. Severity descriptors, whether something is mild, moderate, or severe, or what grade it was, these typically are not within the scope of MedDRA, except if they are relevant for that particular medical concept. Like, for example, you're going to find mild and mental retardation, but it's not a common qualifier to see in MedDRA. When you think about lab values, you're not going to see numerical values in MedDRA that will extend MedDRA way too much. We do have qualified values like increased or decreased or normal or abnormal, but you're not going to find numeric values in MedDRA for lab reagents or investigations. MedDRA also is not intended as a drug dictionary or a dictionary that collects equipments or devices or diagnostic products. There are other dictionaries that are specific for those kind of concepts and definitions. So for those of you in pharmacovigilance, when you think of safety narratives that start with a 49-year-old male of a specific ethnicity who is part of a specific type of clinical trial or a study, taking a specific medication or on a certain device, all of this information is not expected to be covered within the scope of MedDRA. What MedDRA is scoped for, to standardize and to summarize, would be categories of terms classified as medical and health related. So think about signs, symptoms, diseases, diagnoses, therapeutic indications, modifications of physiologic functions, names of investigations, qualitative results of labs or investigations like increased, decreased, present, absent, positive, negative. Those kind of investigation results are in MedDRA. Surgical procedures and medical procedures, medical history, social history, family history, medication errors, all of those items are in MedDRA. And although you may think social circumstances, how are these considered medical terms? Well, if you think about medical scope, social circumstances are relevant when you evaluate regulatory data in the assessment of clinical outcomes of treatments under the light of exposure to risk factors. So, for example, foreign travel could be a risk factor, substance use, tobacco use, bereavement could also be risk factors. So those kind of concepts do exist in MedDRA. MedDRA is a hierarchy, and it is built as a hierarchy system with 5 levels that you can use either from the top down or the bottom up approach. They're linked vertically, meaning that every level from the bottom is subordinate to the linked level above it, and the ones on top are superordinate to the ones below them. When you're coding in MedDRA, the level that you interact with MedDRA is the lowest level term, the one on the bottom. That is the most granular. It has the most number of terms. As of version 28, we had close to 90,000 LLTs, or lowest level terms. LLTs are meant to portray different ways of conveying the natural language term or the verbatim as used in practice or real life by the reporter, which is why there's so many of them. But groups of them can represent a single medical concept, like we talked about the abdominal pain or the belly ache or the abdominal cramp. They are all sisters. They mean the same medical concept. So they are considered siblings. One of these sibling LLTs would be the one chosen or preferred to the rest to represent this standalone medical concept. So that LLT that is chosen or preferred to the rest of its siblings to represent that medical concept is duplicated at the preferred term level. So the every single preferred term will have a duplication at the LLT level. So all of these 26,900 PTs that you see, they are repeated at the LLT levels, and you use them when you are coding. When you are reporting or standardizing or analyzing, the level that you use in MedDRA is the PT level, is the preferred term. And you'll see that they're much less than the LLT, only about 27,000. And as you go higher up the hierarchy, the numbers become even smaller and smaller because related preferred terms get grouped together at the next level, which is the HLT or the high level term. This grouping could be based on anatomy or pathology or physiology or function, as long as they are related preferred terms. And then related HLTs also get grouped together at the high level group terms, or the HLGT, and those again get grouped together under the system organ classes. We call them SOCs. And there's only 27 system organ classes that are classified either by site of manifestation or etiology or purpose. So just looking at this slide and the numbers, you can start to see how safety signals become condensed, starting from your natural language verbatim that you converted into a MedDRA LLT when you coded, all the way to the system organ class. So what are the system organ classes? In MedDRA, the system organ classes, or classification into MedDRA, is grouped into 27 system organ classes, or SOCs. And we said the grouping is usually by site of manifestation, which body system is affected. So you're going to see, for example, cardiac in there. You're going to see ear. You're going to see eye, gastrointestinal. They are all body systems. But that's not the only classification that MedDRA includes, because we also have etiology classifications. So, for example, infections is an etiology, injury is an etiology, neoplasms. These are different also classifications available in MedDRA. And also we have purposes like product issues, social circumstances. These are purpose classifications. Now, the way that an LLT connects to a system organ class is dependent typically on the site of primary manifestation. So if you have a verbatim that you are coding and it's a medical concept under the gastrointestinal system, usually the connection goes to the gastrointestinal system organ class. If it's a respiratory condition, you expect it to be connected to the respiratory system organ class, and so on. And we'll touch base on the hierarchy of the primary system organ class in coming slides. So here's an example of the hierarchy of MedDRA. When you think about arrhythmias, the arrhythmia may have different ways of representing the condition of arrhythmia. So you could have arrhythmia not otherwise specified. That's what NOS stands for. You could have arrhythmia without any qualifier. You could have dysrhythmia, and then you have an LLT that is red, other specified cardiac dysrhythmias. And LLTs that are housed in red boxes are non-current. So these are different LLTs that represent kind of the same medical concept. They are grouped under the same PT of arrhythmia. And that PT of arrhythmia gets linked to the HLT of rate and rhythm disorders, NEC, which means not elsewhere classified, because there could be arrhythmias that are classified. There could be supraventricular arrhythmias or ventricular arrhythmias classified as such. But if there are other types of arrhythmias without a clear classification, then there is a matching HLT that's not elsewhere classified. And those in turn gets linked to the HLGT of cardiac arrhythmias, which falls under the cardiac disorders. And the reason we have these non-current LLTs that are housed in red boxes is a couple of different possibilities. Some terms in MedDRA, when MedDRA was created, were based on terminologies that existed at that time. So when MedDRA was first started, it didn't start out of nothing. It was really based on a standard that existed at the time, which belonged to the predecessor of MHRA. MHRA previously was called Medicines Control Agency. They had their own terminology. So MedDRA was started as that terminology, or based on that terminology, and further developed by the ICH and its partners. And they included some of the terms that existed in other terminologies at that time, like WHOART or ICD or COSTART or JART. But not all of those concepts that were included in MedDRA fitted the rules and regulations for adding terms to MedDRA. So they were included in MedDRA but made non-current. But that's not the only reason that something could be non-current. Sometimes we find that maybe a term that in MedDRA is found to be vague or ambiguous, like if it's truncated or if it is an acronym that is not unique acronym. It could be also misspelled. There could be errors of misspelling in MedDRA that were corrected, so they became non-current. Non-currency only exists at the LLT level in MedDRA. So if a term is no longer considered a valid medical concept or useful medical concept, or new information is now available and we have new naming conventions in the industry or known in the medical field, and some older terminologies became non-current, they will be retained in MedDRA for historical purposes and legacy purposes, so that even if a term becomes non-current in MedDRA, it is retained in MedDRA, but it is not intended to be used for coding. So that's an important note about non-current terms. They are not intended for use in coding. And since we gave the background of how MedDRA started, it explains why we have British spelling in MedDRA at the PT level and higher. So for example, anemia in MedDRA at the PT level is the British spelling of anemia. And anything in the HLT and higher is the British spelling of the medical concept. American spelling exists at the LLT level. So for standardization to work well, especially in electronic data exchange, the codes must also be available in numeric format. And that's what MedDRA does. Every term in MedDRA is assigned a unique 8-digit code that does not change. And these codes remain the same no matter what language of MedDRA you are using, which makes it easier to communicate across different regions of the world. These codes are non-expressive. So the number, just looking at the number, it will not tell you anything about that term, what level of MedDRA it is, whether it's an LLT or a SOC, which SOC it represents, whether it's a cardiac term or a gastrointestinal term. So these numbers are non-expressive. They are assigned in numerical order as new terms are added to MedDRA. And we said they never change, but just to be 100% transparent about this, in the very early releases of MedDRA, think about versions older than version 5, there were a small number of terms that had their MedDRA codes changed. But since version 5, there were no changes to the MedDRA codes of term names. And these codes play a very important role in electronic submissions. Think about E2B-R3, for example. All right, before we talk about multi-axiality, any questions so far, Hannah?
We have one question asking if you could go over when to use LLT versus PT again, please.
Sure. So when you're coding in MedDRA, and let me just take you back to this slide. When you're coding in MedDRA, you code to the LLT level. And the LLTs are the most numerous level in MedDRA. They're the most granular, the most detailed terms that exist in MedDRA are the LLTs. So when you're trying to find a best match for your term in MedDRA, you're looking at the LLT level. The PT level is, the PTs are also LLTs, and maybe that becomes confusing to some people, that every single PT exists in MedDRA also at the LLT level. So when folks say you code directly to the PT level, basically they mean they're coded to the LLT. That was also a PT level term. And that's the confusing part a little bit when you're coding. But when you're analyzing, usually when you're running your listings, and maybe you can take a look in your organization at an example output of data, usually when you have an output of your listings or when you're submitting to the regulator, usually you use the PT level term. And it's a much smaller bucket than the LLTs, because there could be a good number of LLTs that represent the same medical concept. So every PT could have a bunch of different LLTs under it. But each LLT can only connect to one PT. So the connection between LLT and PT is 1-to-1. The LLT will only connect to one PT, but then after that, the PTs could connect to more than one system organ class. And that's what we're talking about in the next level, in the next slide. So I hope that answered the question, but if not, please feel free to come back to us with follow-up questions. So let's talk about how MedDRA can be multi-axial. When we showed that hierarchy slide and said how LLTs connect in the hierarchy to the system organ class, the usual connection between the LLTs and the system organ class is based on the site of primary manifestation. So if it's a GI term, you expect the connection to go to the gastrointestinal sock. If it's a respiratory term that you're looking at, you expect it to be linked to the respiratory system organ class. And that's usually the case. But sometimes the same manifestation can be represented by more than one body system or more than one system organ class. If that's the case, then the preferred term can be linked to more than one system organ class. And this is what is called a multi-axial representation, where the same PT could be grouped under different classifications. And it will be available to you based on your needs to do your data retrieval and presentation by different sets of data based on the specific need. So, for example, let's talk about a skin cancer. Skin cancer is a cancer, so you expect it to be linked to the neoplasm system organ class, but it also manifests in the skin. So you expect it to be linked to the skin system organ class. So yes, it does link to both of them as a multi-axial term in MedDRA. Not every PT in MedDRA links to more than one system organ class. About maybe a little over 40% of PTs in MedDRA are multi-axial. But because they are linked to more than one system organ class, we don't want to count them more than once when we're doing our listings at the end. We don't want to do double counting. So what the MSSO does is it determines which of these system organ classes is going to be defaulted as the primary system organ class. So when you run your outputs and you look at your data and you default to the primary system organ class, there's only one. So, you're not going to count the same event twice. And having a primary system organ class predefined by the MSSO, that supports the standardization of data because it is the same primary system organ class no matter where in the world you are operating. And of course, the one thing to stress here is that the primary system organ class allocation is predefined. It should never, ever be changed by users, even if you figure out a way to change the system organ class once you have your MedDRA files. Please don't change the system organ class. If you change the primary allocation of system organ class, you're no longer using the standardized dictionary. You can always customize the way you look at your data and you analyze your data because you have the secondary system organ classes, but don't change the allocation of the primary system organ class. Now, the rules of which primary system organ class gets chosen when the same PT can belong to more than one different SOC is the following. If the PT represents a condition that only belongs to one system organ class, then that system organ class is automatically assigned as the primary SOC. So PTs for diseases or signs or symptoms are assigned to the system organ class that represents the site of primary manifestation. Excuse me. But there are three main exceptions. And I want you to think back to that picture of that child you saw with the thalidomide injuries. Thalidomide led to many congenital deformities that affected different parts of the body, right? So you had some children born with deformities in their limbs, and some in their eyes, and some in their ears, and some in the heart, and some in the nervous system. If those are the primary site of manifestation, then you will disperse that signal. But it's important for us to amplify that signal for congenital deformities. If we have a new product and we're trying to make sure that it's a safe product, we want to make sure it's not going to lead to congenital deformities. And it's not going to lead to any cancer. And it's not going to lead to any infections. So those three types of conditions are amplified when we create the primary system organ class allocation. So going back to that skin cancer, if cancer can happen from a product that is being tested on humans, then we want to know that cancer is happening regardless where it's happening. If congenital deformities can happen from a product we're testing on humans, we should be made aware that there are congenital deformities happening regardless of which body system is impacted, and same for infections. So even though primary system organ class allocation usually is the site of primary manifestation, the three exceptions are congenital issues, neoplasms, and infections. Those trump the rest. So if the same condition could belong to an infection and, for example, a kidney disorder, the primary system organ class that is predefined in MedDRA will be the infection system organ class. The kidneys will be secondary. The same thing for neoplasm. If something can be a lung cancer, for example, the primary system organ class would be the cancer, the neoplasm soc. The secondary would be the respiratory. So here are examples of multi-axial terms in MedDRA. If you think of obesity, cardiomyopathy, the condition is a cardiomyopathy. So the primary system organ class allocation would be the heart under cardiac disorders, but it's also associated with obesity. So you do have a secondary link in this particular term to the metabolism and nutrition disorders on the left hand of the screen. But what about, for example, influenza? Influenza is an infection that happens in the respiratory system. So it is linked to the respiratory system organ class, but the link is secondary. And why is it secondary? It's because infections are one of those three main safety areas that you really want to make sure you're amplifying the signals for: the congenital conditions, the neoplasm conditions, and the infection conditions. So I hope this kind of explains the idea of what it means to be multi-axial and how the primary system organ class is allocated. But if you have any questions, please do post them and we'll address them. Okay, MedDRA maintenance. MedDRA is a living, breathing dictionary. It's a living, breathing standard. So it does change based on our knowledge in medical concepts collectively as a scientific community. Most changes that happen to MedDRA occur as a result of change requests from MedDRA users like yourselves. Every organization that has a subscription to MedDRA is allowed up to 100 change requests per month, and every single one of those is reviewed by the international medical officer teams that works on the MedDRA maintenance. So they are reviewed by physicians from different regions of the world who have experience in MedDRA. Simple changes to MedDRA affect the LLT and PT levels, and usually those kind of change requests will have a response back to the submitter within 7 to 10 business days. Complex changes where somebody requests a change above the PT level, so we're talking about levels that are used in data analysis and data standardization, those get shared with the MedDRA user community before the MSSO decides whether or not to implement them, because MedDRA is intended for the MedDRA user community, and changes that are impactful to the standardization and analysis of MedDRA will be important for them. So we need their input before deciding what to do. And of course, many people know that there are 2 releases of MedDRA annually. There's one coming up in March for the next version of MedDRA, and that's the X.0 release, which could include changes from any level of MedDRA. So we call it a complex release. The one in September for the X.1 version is a simple release where the only changes included would be at the LLT and the PT level. To submit changes to MedDRA, any user will have access to a web-based tool for change requests that's called a web CR. Of course, it will need a username and password to access it. Requests will be in English, and of course, the user must define what are they requesting. Are they requesting to add a term, change a term, make a change to a standardized MedDRA query, an SMQ? Is it a translation term? You receive an immediate confirmation that the change request was received, and it enables you to see previous histories of change requests. So you can actually track them down up until MedDRA version 5.1, which would be interesting to see. So if you think of a term and say, I wish that term was in MedDRA, you can actually go into the WebCR and look it up and see if it was previously requested. And if it was previously requested, what the rationale for not accepting it was. You have access to that. The interface is user-friendly. So once you access the tool, it actually walks you through it. Of course, you will need, like we said, a change request password. Many organizations will designate a specific person to be the point of contact for submitting change requests. So before you go ahead and submit any, please check internally to see if you have a designated person of contact. This is what the tool would look like. So if you want to add a new LLT in MedDRA, you do need to specify what the new term that you are looking for is. So you have to give a term at the minimum. You can, if you want, suggest the hierarchy. So you can, for example, say, I'd like to add a new LLT under the following PT and link it to this particular HLT under the following SOC. You can. Of course, the IMOs, the International Medical Officers, when they review these change requests, may or may not agree with you, but they will review everything that you submit. And one of the most important bits of information to submit is your rationale. The more details you give in your rationale, the better it is for the review process. There are things called MedDRA proactive maintenance. So it's a bit more broader than just requesting one term to MedDRA. It's usually when you have an idea for a general improvement to MedDRA. These kind of ideas or initiatives could also be started internally by the MSSO or suggested by users. If you have a general idea for a maintenance request, please submit that to the MSSO help desk and give your justification. Maybe you're asking us to look at a certain section in MedDRA that you want us to revisit for the hierarchy, or maybe you want to propose consistency across different areas in the same SOC, for example. The maintenance requests tend to be broader, so they're not limited to the 7 to 10 business day turnaround, and they don't replace the change request process. Okay, before we go into MedDRA tools, any questions so far, Hannah?
Yes, we've had a couple questions come in. Our first one asks, which term would you recommend to be used for signal management analysis?
So when you're talking about signal analysis and signal management and safety review, your starting point is always the preferred term. So your preferred term is your starting point for aggregating data, standardizing data, and analyzing data. Once you have your preferred term available to you, you have different options in MedDRA, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the webinars that talk about data analysis with MedDRA. So when you have your preferred term coded and available to you, then it's up to you to decide if you want to look at the system organ class, to start with the system organ class as a general overview of a quick look at your data to see, are there any terms clustered in the same body system that maybe I want to take a look at. So for example, if you start with your early data and you have about maybe 500 events totally or 100 events totally, you can start with the system organ class in your data output as a primary output. So default it to your primary SOC. You can take a quick look and say, do I have a cluster of data in a particular system organ class, and start there. And then if you do, you can drill down below the system organ class and take a look at the HLGTs and HLTs and see, is there a particular area, for example, cardiac, is there a particular area in the cardiac that most of my events are coming from? Is it an arrhythmia disorder, or is it a function disorder? Is it some other kind of disorder? You can take a look at them that way. You can also look at your data using the secondary system organ classes. That expands your view of your data. Because going back to those 3 exclusions of system organ classes, if you have a kidney infection and you're looking at your data in their primary system organ class as a default output, you're going to see that as an infection sock. But if you have other types of events clustering from your kidney system organ class, you also want to capture any infections in the kidney as part of that look. So that's where it's beneficial to even look at your data in both primary and secondary system organ classes when you're evaluating safety. Those kind of details are available in our webinar for data analysis and retrieval with MedDRA. So please take a look at that webinar if you're interested in that. And there's a lot more information in those webinars. Any other question?
Our next two questions are both about multi-axial socks. The first one asks, how do you link multi-axial socks to the same PT in Med?
We're gonna show that example when we do the web-based browser demonstration. So please hold on to that question, Hannah, and remind me when I'm doing the demo, because there will be many terms that have multiple socks, and we'll show how that happens.
Perfect. And then the last question was also about multi-axiality. It was asking, do you check all that apply versus only one option when it's multi-axial?
All that apply for sure. I mean, we do have preferred terms in MedDRA that are linked to more than 2 system organ classes. I think the max we have is 8 system organ classes, especially when you think about, for example, congenital syndromes. I mean, some of them impact multiple different body systems, and they impact the brain, the heart, the kidneys, maybe even developmental impact. So you do link them to as many system organ classes as apply to that particular medical concept. So thank you for those questions. All right, let's talk about MedDRA tools. And there are tools available to the MSSO, to the MedDRA users. They are part of your subscription. So all the tools we're going to be talking about are available to you. There's no additional cost to anything for using these tools. There are 3 different browsers available for the MedDRA users. We have a desktop browser called the MDB, a web-based browser, the WBB, and a mobile browser, the MMB. And you'll see under the web-based browser, there are 2 links because we are in the process of finalizing the new web-based browser. So right now we have 2 web-based browsers, both active, both available to you. One is a legacy browser, one is the new web-based browser. They have the same functionalities. None of the functionalities have been removed. It's just that the screen for interaction with the browser has been modified to make it more user-friendly for search purposes, because it showed that the most use people are getting from the browser is for the search functionality. So that was the modification for the new web-based browser, just to make it easier to conduct the search functionality. But to kind of summarize what the browsers do, all of the browsers require a MedDRA ID and password to be able to operate. And of course, if you're an organization, all of your employees who have access to your, as part of your organization, who have access to your subscription, will be able to access these browsers. They will enable you to view MedDRA terms, whether it's in the system organ class view or the standardized MedDRA query view, and conduct searches. You can conduct searches by across all the different available MedDRA languages. You can choose the language of your interface to whichever language you're comfortable with, and you're able to export search results with the exception of the mobile browser. The mobile browser is not an app. It's just a link that is designed to be viewed in a mobile screen. So the output of it is designed for a mobile screen, but it's not an app. Now, the 2 main browsers, the desktop browser and the web-based browsers, also have the same functionality. You can view primary and secondary links information. You can upload your own data and run against the tools available in these browsers, like the standardized MedDRA query tool. You can conduct searches by using your advanced search options or the Boolean options, and I'll show you what that means when we do the demo. And in the web-based browser, because it's on the web and it's maintained, updated all the time by the MSSO. You can even see what's coming next. So right now, the MSSO is preparing for that March release, which is going to be version 29.0. That information has already been reviewed and validated by the MSSO physicians, so we know what terms are coming out in the next release. That is called supplemental information, and that supplemental information is available on the web-based browser. But of course, the web-based browser is internet-based, so you need to have internet connection. One of the advantages of the desktop browser is that you download it to your desktop, and then you can operate in it without even being connected to the internet. But when you download the desktop browser and you want to work in it, it's kind of empty of all MedDRA files. It has all the functionalities, but it doesn't have MedDRA files. So you need to decide which MedDRA files you want to work in, which MedDRA versions and which languages, and then download them into the desktop browser. And we have videos available on our website that walk you through how to download the desktop browser and the MedDRA files. This is a screenshot of what the new web-based browser looks like. The focus for the interface is on the search functionality. So when you open the new web-based browser, what you'll primarily be looking at is the search panels within the browser. Compared to the legacy browser, if you look at the screen, this is what the legacy browser looks like. It does have the search functionality in the middle, but it also has all the other panels straight away in your landing screen. So that's the main difference between the legacy browser and the web-based browsers, but they both have the same functionality. This is a screenshot of the desktop browser, so you'll see the same panels, the same functionalities available to you. I'm going to give you a few bits of information on another tool, and then demo the browser. There is a tool for MedDRA users called MedDRA Version Analysis Tool, or the MVAT. Also available to you, also free for the subscribers, so there's no additional charge. The interesting part of the MedDRA Version Analysis Tool is that it allows you to compare two different versions of MedDRA. They don't have to be consecutive versions of MedDRA. So you can compare two different versions of MedDRA. If you have data in a certain MedDRA version and you're thinking about upversioning, or you received updated information in a different MedDRA version, you can run a MedDRA version analysis tool to find out any differences between two different versions of MedDRA. You can also input your own data that you coded to a specific MedDRA version and identify changes to a different MedDRA version. So let's say you have data that you coded in MedDRA version 27, and it stayed at MedDRA version 27. And now you're thinking about upversioning to MedDRA version 29 or MedDRA version 28.1. You can actually input your coded data, your MedDRA coded data of MedDRA version 27 into this tool and run a data impact report and see, is there impact on my data compared to version 29? Is any of the LLTs that I used in my version 27 now considered non-current? Or maybe any of the LLTs I used in my version 27 has now been promoted to a PT level, or maybe has now been linked to a different system organ class that I need to be made aware of. The third functionality of the tool is that you can plug in a term in MedDRA, and it gives you the history of that term, when it was added, if it was changed, when it was changed, and what the change was. The tool also allows you to change the language of your interface, just like the browser, and to run your analysis across the different languages of MedDRA, and to run your analysis or your report on supplemental changes. So I can actually check right now. We are at version 28.1. We're looking for version 29. I can run an impact report or a version report in that tool and ask the tool what's going to change between 28.1 and 29, and the tool will give me all the details. And the tool also allows me to identify impact to data on secondary system organ classes. So that's all available in the MVAT tool. This is what the MedDRA version analysis tool looks like when you log in. One of the nice features of the new web-based browser is that it houses the MVAT tool. So if you have access to the new web-based browser, the tool is embedded in it. And as you can see in this screenshot, there is also a secondary link for the tool outside of the new web-based browser that you can also still link to. It's still active, and this is what it looks like. It's the same functionality, whether it's embedded within the WBB, the web-based browser, or whether it is a standalone tool. It is the same functionality. All right, before we move on to coding with MedDRA, I want to show you what the browsers look like, and you can actually test it on your own as well. If you don't have access to your own organizational credentials, I do believe Hannah has included temporary credentials for the web-based browser within the chat. So if you want to take a look at that and maybe access it as we go through it or afterwards and try it on your own, you can do that as well. So let me take you back to our website. So here's the MedDRA.org website, and there are more than one way to access the web-based browsers. The one that gives you a quick link to both of them under How to Use. So the How to Use tab is a very useful tab for MedDRA users because it has many of the items and the resources that will be helpful for you as a MedDRA user, including the support documentation, which we'll be talking about next, and the tools. And the tools include the web-based browsers, the MedDRA version analysis tool, the SMQ analysis tool, the APIs, and any mapping. So they're all available to you. But right here on the screen, if you look at the related links, you're going to find the links to different items. You have the link to download the desktop browser. You can open up the web-based browser, which is the legacy browser. You can open up the MedDRA version analysis tool or open up the new web-based browser. So I'm going to show you both of them and do a quick demo. This is the new web-based browser. And of course, you do need to enter your MedDRA ID and password. But like I said, we do have the temporary credentials available to you. So just like in the screenshot on the slide, when you open this tool for the new web-based browser, it right away takes you to the search functionality, which is the main feature of the new web-based browser. I also want to show you the legacy browser. So here's the link for the legacy browser, or up here on the right-hand side of the MedDRA.org are the quick links to the WBB. This is still the legacy browser, so if we click on it, it takes us to the login to the legacy browser. Right here, you can also change your preferred language if you like, but let me log in English. And this is the legacy web-based browser. So I'm going to demo some of the functionalities here, but they're the same between the legacy browser and the new web-based browser. The legacy browser simply lays out your preferences, your language options, your version options on the top, and links to the different references here in the blue boxes. So when you log in, and when I log in, it defaults to my preferred language of English and the most recent MedDRA version 28.1 under the System Organ Class view. And just as an FYI, you can change this to the SMQ view, and it takes you to the standardized MedDRA queries. But let me go back to the System Organ Class. I can change the languages as I like. The one that's kind of yellowish, a little bit in yellow, that will give me the order of how the languages will be displayed once I change languages. So for example, I want English, let's do Arabic, and I want Croatian. So in my display now, I see the three languages, and they are in this order. The one in the yellowish color appears first, and then the second language, and then the third. And I can look up terms in any of these three languages as I like. So in my search options box here, I can pick whatever language that I want to search in and put in the terminologies. But let me go back to my defaults. This is my release view. Release view basically means that I'm looking at all the available MedDRA versions from 28.1 all the way down to the first official MedDRA version under the MSSO 2.1, because anything earlier than that was an ICH creation. So 2.1 all the way up until 28.1. These are my releases. But if I want to look at my supplemental, remember we said we can look at supplemental data, data that has been reviewed and processed for the next version, but not yet released. I can select supplemental. IMO view is not something you're going to see on your end because it's specific to the medical officers at the MSSO, but let's look at supplemental. You'll see how the color changes to kind of give you a heads up that you are in supplemental. Some of the terms you're going to see here may or may not be available to you for coding. So let's expand cardiac disorders, for example, and look at arrhythmias. We said that we have a top-down approach in MedDRA or a bottom-up approach in MedDRA. If I'm interested in cardiac arrhythmias, I can go into my cardiac disorders here on the left-hand side and expand cardiac disorders and take a look to see what kind of cardiac disorders available to me in the high-level grouping terms. So there's my arrhythmias, there's my cardiac neoplasm, cardiac valve disorder, congenital cardiac disorders, coronary disorders, endocardial, heart failures, myocardial, and pericardial. Those are the kind of classifications under the general cardiac SOC. If I expand the high-level grouping terms for cardiac arrhythmias, I'll see the different types of arrhythmias in classifications. So there's cardiac conduction disorders, the supraventricular or ventriculars, and then we have the rate and rhythm disorders not elsewhere classified. So what about these, for example, supraventricular arrhythmias? If I expand them, then I see the preferred terms, the specific preferred terms that are grouped under the supraventricular arrhythmias. And if you'll notice, some of them have this interrupted line around them. The ones that have the interrupted line are the ones that are new. They are not yet part of the official MedDRA release, but they have been approved for addition to MedDRA by the medical officers, the physicians at the MSSO. They have been accepted, finalized, and added. They are waiting for the next official release of MedDRA to be part of the MedDRA files. So you won't be able to still use them for official coding and submission yet because they have not yet been released, but they're coming. So you can either decide to wait until the next release is available if they are the best fit for you, or use a placeholder in the interim until the official release happens. So that's the difference between the supplemental and the official. So if I, for example, the atrial fibrillation conversion pause, if I open this history for this particular term, it doesn't have which number version it was added yet. It's still supplemental. But if I right click, for example, the atrial flutter and open that history, it will tell me that the atrial flutter has been available since the very first release of MedDRA in 2.1. These PTs, when you expand them, so for example, atrial tachycardia, you can see the different LLTs that are grouped under that PT. So we said every PT is repeated at the LLT level. So atrial tachycardia is repeated at the PT level and LLT level, but there's other LLTs available. If it's an atrial ectopic tachycardia or multifocal or paroxysmal or a tachycardia paroxysmal atrial, these kind of nuances or these kind of details may be important to a cardiologist, for example, who is keen on the very minutia of the disorder of atrial tachycardia. But when you're thinking about standardizing the atrial tachycardia, you may think that these are not significant enough to be at the PT level for analysis. You want to group them all under the same PT of atrial tachycardia. So these LLTs for purposes of MedDRA are considered sibling LLTs. They may or may not be synonymous, but they are sibling LLTs. They belong under the same parent of atrial tachycardia. And you'll notice these different color boxes. So to understand what the different colors mean, I can pull up my legends. And here's my legends. When I'm in the MedDRA hierarchy of the system organ classes and I see the different colored boxes, if I see a red box, a PT in a red box, basically this means that this particular term that I'm looking at, the arrhythmia supraventricular, is a uniaxial term. It only belongs to one axis. It only belongs to one system organ class. So this particular PT, the arrhythmia supraventricular, only belongs to the system organ class of cardiac disorders. It is not linked anywhere else, which makes sense because it's a supraventricular arrhythmia. So the site of manifestation is the heart. It's not an infection. It's not a cancer. It's not a neoplasm, and it's not associated with other body disorders. So it is cardiac. So yes, it makes sense that it has a red box, and red means stop. There's no other system organ classes linked to this PT. What about a green one? If I'm looking at a green box, the legend tells me a green box housing around the PT means this is a multi-axial term, and you're looking at it in the secondary link or the secondary system organ class. So what's the example here? It is chronic atrial and intestinal dysrhythmia syndrome, as well as congenital supraventricular tachycardia. So they're telling me that this is a term that is linked to more than one system organ class, but under the cardiac SOC, the link is secondary. So it's not the primary link. And if I just want to show you what the primary link is, if I click on them, if I click on this, you're going to notice the term details here in the right-hand corner are going to change. So if I click on this, you're going to see the details in this panel on the right-hand side are showing you exactly how many system organ classes are linked to this particular PT. You'll see 3 of them. The primary link is congenital because this is a congenital condition. So it has to be linked primarily to the congenital system organ class. It is also a cardiac disorder, so it has a secondary link to the cardiac disorder, and that's why we see it with a green box underneath the cardiac disorders. And it also has a third link because it also is a gastrointestinal disorder. It is chronic atrial and intestinal dysrhythmia syndrome. So it does impact also the gastrointestinal system. And that's why it has a third link to the gastrointestinal disorder. So I hope this gives an example of the question that was asked. Are the links to all that apply? Yes. And how are they linked? Well, it depends on what kind of medical concept or medical condition this is. So when the medical officers review a submission for a new term, they're going to decide how many body systems it impacts and how many system organ classes it needs to be linked to based on what type of condition it is. And then once they decide, what is the primary defaulted system organ class. Is it a congenital disorder? If so, it has to link primarily to the congenital system organ class, and then the secondary links are established. Well, what about this one, the congenital supraventricular tachycardia? It's linked to 2 system organ classes, not 3, because it is a congenital disorder and a cardiac disorder only. All right, so what about the blue box? If I go back to the legend, if a PT is listed in this system organ class and has a blue box, it means you are looking at a multi-axial term, but you are looking at it here under the primary link. So it's a multi-axial primary term. And of course, the system organ class, the primary system organ class always has a blue box, like we said. The LLT in a red box is non-current, and these are for Japanese terms, so we don't need to talk about them today. So let's see an example of a blue box. If I click on neonatal sinus bradycardia. I'll see that, yes, it is a cardiac disorder. So it is linked to the primary site of manifestation, which is the cardiac disorder, as a primary link, but it is also a neonatal disorder. And that's an important age, like we mentioned in MedDRA. So it does have a secondary link under pregnancy, puerperium, and perinatal conditions, SOC, specifically under the HLT of neonatal cardiovascular disorders. So that's an example of multilinks and multi-axiality and what the color codes mean. Let me go back to the default settings rather than the supplemental. So did that answer the questions, Hannah, for those multi-axial questions?
I received confirmation from one that their question was answered, but I have not seen a follow-up from the other asker.
Okay, if we did not answer your question, please come back if you have any follow-up. All right, so the default that I'm looking at here is not showing me the numeric codes, but of course, if I want to look at numeric codes, I can always click here and you'll see how each numeric identifier becomes available. This is helpful when you're communicating with, for example, somebody in IT. They don't really want the text, they just want the numeric code. You can retrieve the numeric code from the browser. Other things that I can show you here is that you can also open new browser windows. You can open as many as you like if you want to. You can have access to the MedDRA documentation, which we said we're going to be talking about next when we talk about MedDRA conventions, but you can link to the MedDRA documentation while you're in the browser without exiting the browser. There's a user guide to walk you through what the browser panels each represents. So if you're interested, you have access to the user guide. These are tools for analysis in MedDRA that we demo in our respective webinars for data analysis with MedDRA. And what else can I show you? Let me show you an example of a search within MedDRA. So when you're looking for terms in MedDRA, we said that we can do the top down. If I'm looking, for example, for arrhythmia, a specific type of arrhythmia. What about if I want to do a bottom-up search? Here's my search box. I can put in the word that I'm looking for. So let's say I'm looking for arrhythmia. And of course, it doesn't have to be a full word. I can go arrhyth and just leave it at that and hit enter. Now, the default boxes here means that it's automatically going to show me anything with this sequence of letters, whether it's at the LLT level, PT, HLT, HLGT, or SOC. It's also going to engage the synonym list, meaning that if there are synonyms embedded within MedDRA, it's going to retrieve them. And I'll show you an example next. It's going to ignore diacritical marks, and diacritical marks are not used in every language, but think about, for example, French has diacritical marks, Arabic has diacritical marks, so it ignores the diacritical marks to make it easier to retrieve results, and it will show you the output with categories like, is this an exact match? Is this a lexical variant? So an exact match, if I put in a full word and I hit enter, it found an exact match for arrhythmia. Now, lexical means the order of the words may be different. If I put in arrhythmia atrial and I hit enter, now it showed me a lexical variant where it has the same output, but in the different order of atrial arrhythmia. So that's a lexical match. Contains search results means how many of my output contains these two words. And you'll notice that when I did arrhythmia, and I go back, arrhythmia as standalone had a total of 87 results, 59 of them at the LLT level that I can expand here and take a look. But if I know for a fact that it was atrial and I put in the atrial, then I only had 6. So the more, when you search, the more words you put in, the less output you're going to get, of course. Let's try something with convulsions. If I enter convulsions, it's going to tell me it found an exact match of convulsion, nothing lexical because it's only one word, and it had 238 matches under synonym search. So what does that mean? When I expand that, I'm going to see return items with words like epilepsy or seizure, even though I didn't use the word epilepsy or seizure in my search, but it's part of my synonym list embedded within MedDRA. So MedDRA tries to help out by saying, if you're looking for bleeding, maybe you're looking for all of these different words. So even if I type in bleed, it's going to retrieve words that have hemorrhage in them. Same, for example, for COVID, it's going to look for SARS. If I put in, for example, heart, it's going to look for cardiac or cardio. For kidney, it's going to look for renal. So it helps out that way, where even if it's not the exact word and the exact letters, but if it has a synonym, it's going to retrieve it. And of course, if I'm not sure if this is the kind of convulsion I'm interested in, I can always click on every single LLT, and the right panel here will show me all the details of this LLT, what the PT is, what the HLT is, what the HLGT is, and the system organ class, and whether or not it's the primary one. So if I have a term with multiple system organ classes, just looking at them, I can tell by the blue box which one is the primary. If I think, for example, there's too many of these for me to look at, there's over 200, there's too many of these, I want to maybe restrict it even more. I know I'm looking for generalized convulsions. I can go into my advanced search, and I want to specify that it begins with general, and it contains the word seizure. And then I'm going to search, and I'll see it's a much smaller list to go through, only 22. So if I know what the exact term I'm looking for, I might be able to find it easier with the advanced search, with the Boolean options, rather than sift through 200 or 300 term outputs. And you'll see that it's showing me the non-current LLTs because it's clicked here. But if I don't want non-current LLTs because I'm coding, I can untick for non-current LLTs, rerun my search, and they will no longer appear. So that's an example of a quick demo of how to use the browser. We do have video casts and webinars dedicated to demos, so please take a look at our YouTube channel, and you'll find them available. All right, let's talk about the next part of our presentation, which is coding conventions. Coding conventions are written guidelines. They are principles for using MedDRA that will help you be consistent, because consistency is always key in good quality data output. The conventions will aim to harmonize how the MedDRA exchange data becomes standardized worldwide. And conventions will help you address common questions that coders may have, like how do you address if a term is misspelled, or if you receive abbreviations or acronyms? What do you do with combination terms that you receive from your sources, and are there terms you want to query for? So for example, if you have chest pain, do you want to query that to see if it's cardiac or not? And we need conventions because people who are coding have different experiences and aptitudes, and they may or may not have enough experience in the certain field or specific product that you are working on. And of course, you want to enhance consistency, especially if some coders had experience in older terminologies than MedDRA. And even if you are using an autoencoder, you still need conventions, and you still need manual coding, because the autoencoder does not necessarily always get it right. So ICH was aware also that it would be useful for MedDRA users to have ICH endorsed coding guidelines. And that's what their documents for points to consider basically are. They have a document titled MedDRA term selection, points to consider. This is a term selection guidance, meaning it's a coding guidance, because basically coding in MedDRA, you are selecting a MedDRA term. So these ICH endorsed guidelines do provide selection advice for industry and regulatory purposes. Of course, it's not mandatory. They are points to consider, but these were created by panelists of subject matter experts from both the regulatory part of the industry as well as the industry. So you do want to reference them because they will satisfy the needs of regulators as well as industry organizations. Their objective is to promote accuracy and consistency in coding so that this facilitates understanding of shared data, and they are recommended to be used as the basis for individual organizations' specific home-based coding conventions. We do advise that organizations create their own coding conventions because the MedDRA term selection points to consider is intended for the wider audience, but we can't really target everybody's specific needs, and your organization may have a specific approach or a specific product line that has a specific approach. So having organization-specific coding conventions is really useful and really important. These ICH-endorsed guidelines are developed by a working group of the ICH Management Committee, and they are updated every March. So they come out in complete versions in maybe six or seven languages. And then we have them also available in condensed versions available on the website. So just to show you where you can find them, if I go back to our website, here's the website. And to access the documents, there's multiple ways to access the documents. You can go to how to use support documentation, and you'll see these banners. You can also click on this green and blue arrow. It will take you to this same exact page, or you can click on the PTC here on the top right-hand corner, which will take you to the same page, but with the blue ribbon defaulted open. So the blue ribbon has the ICH endorsed guidelines. Here's your points to consider for term selection. It's in different formats. You also have a MedDRA data retrieval and presentation points to consider for analysis with MedDRA. So yes, there is an ICH endorsed guideline for analysis with MedDRA. And then you have the companion document. It has a lot of information about medication errors and product issues if you're interested in those fields. And then you have MedDRA best practices, which has a lot of good information about upversioning with MedDRA. The gray ribbons, they have version-specific documents supportive to MedDRA use from the MSSO. So these are not ICH endorsed necessarily, but they are created by the MSSO, and they talk about version-specific resources. The introductory guide to MedDRA for anybody who's new to MedDRA is a really helpful document. It walks you through, especially the first 20 or so pages, walks you through the thought process behind the building of MedDRA. What does equivalence versus hierarchical structural mean? The scope that we talked about, how they approach spelling or abbreviations, what are the capitalization rules or punctuation rules in MedDRA, and how do they list body site considerations in MedDRA? So for example, under body site consideration, if you have an eyelid, is this an eye or is this a skin? So that decision was already made during the building of MedDRA, and they decided that the eyelid will be classified as a structure of the eye. So this is really helpful. Like I said, the first 20 or so pages are really helpful if you're new to MedDRA. Even if you're not new to MedDRA, it's a really nice outline of the thought process behind the specific building of MedDRA. So let me take you back to the slides and give you one example from the MedDRA term selection points to consider. Like one of the cardinal rules of MedDRA is that you select a lowest level term when you're coding, and you only select the current LLT. You don't select a non-current LLT. You also try to select the LLT that is most accurately reflective of what your source says of your reported verbatim. So for example, abscess on face. MedDRA does allow you to code as a standalone abscess, But is that enough? Because abscess can occur in different parts of the body. You can have them in the lungs, you can have them in the brain, and that makes it very different than an abscess on the face, which is the skin. So when you're coding in MedDRA, always try to find the most detailed LLT that you can find that has all of the information you received. So even though the words abscess on face does not exist in MedDRA, but abscess facial or facial abscess does exist in MedDRA. And this is, I think, maybe an important point to kind of illustrate in the browser. So if we go to the browser and we go to basic search and we just put in abscess, there's close to 500 options in MedDRA with the word abscess in them, and there's a standalone abscess. And if you click on the standalone abscess, that takes you to infections and infestations, and the HLT is infections not elsewhere classified. But if I just add the root of face, just FAC, and I click search, I'm going to find my facial abscess, which has a secondary link to the skin system organ class. So it's really important when you're looking for the best matches in your browser to put in as many roots as you can. Because if we go back to the standalone abscess and see different examples, for example, a breast abscess will have a different secondary link and a different preferred term. In the eye, it will link as secondarily linked to the eye disorder. In the neck, it will link as secondary to the musculoskeletal. So it's really important to try to find the closest matching LLT to your verbatim, to your source information, because that will be the best PT with that level of detail. But all of them, if you noticed, went to the primary sock infections because that trumps the site of the abscess. Okay, let me take you back to the next bit of information. One thing to remember is that non-current LLTs, the ones in the red boxes, are there for legacy conversion and historical purposes. They're not meant for coding. Okay, if we talk about another cardinal rule or principle that you also see in your PTC document, it will advise you to report all of the information you received. So every single adverse event you received should be coded, regardless of causality to the product. And MedDRA does have terms that will allow you to code device-related events or product quality issues, medication errors. We have a webinar specific for medication errors that's really very interesting. It also allows you to code things that are not clearly medical terms like social history. And of course, not every diction, not every possible option available for the end user exists in MedDRA because people talk in their own way. Somebody could report a headache as a throbbing above the temple, or an aching all over the head, or a pulsing pain in the head. We can't add possibilities in MedDRA as headaches for every single way that somebody can convey that. We know that these are headaches, so we can choose the LLT headache because that's what these conditions represent. Infection in lungs, we do have lung infection in MedDRA. We don't necessarily have the words infection in lungs as an LLT in MedDRA. So it doesn't have to be exact match to the verbatim, but it has to be the closest match to the verbatim. And in some examples, like the third example on your screen, maybe a single LLT is not enough to convey the entirety of what you're receiving from your source. So if the patient took drug A instead of drug B and experienced hypertension, you're talking about a medication error and a sequelae. Both of these are very important pieces of information. It's not covered in one single LLT in MedDRA. So there are scenarios where your reported verbatim, your narrative, your source information cannot be covered by a single LLT, and you may need to select more than one LLT to capture the entirety of the information received. That document, the term selection points, really has a nice selection of different types of scenarios that you can reference. And you don't really need to read the document in one shot. When you're coding, if you come across a scenario for location versus microorganism infection and how do you approach this, you can just find that relative section in the PTC document and just read that section. So as you're going through your coding activities or review activities, you can find the section that's relevant to your term in the PTC document and read that. And there's so many of them that's really not possible to go through them in a webinar. So the PTC documents, like we said, covered the two main areas, the coding in MedDRA, which we call the term selection, and the data retrieval and presentation, which is the analysis documents. And they're available in multiple languages, like we said. The companion document is a very interesting document to those of you interested in medication errors, in manufacturing and quality issues and such. So there are a lot of examples in that companion document. We already went over the coding demonstration with the MedDRA browser. So I'm going to talk now about the standardized MedDRA queries. Do we have a lot of questions? Hannah, this is the last section in the webinar, so I can continue and open at the end, but if we have a lot, maybe I can address a couple now.
We just have 2 pending questions at the moment.
Okay, let's go through them.
All right, the first one asks if you could just, as a reminder, say what the SOC supplemental view colors mean, red PTs versus green versus blue.
Sure. So let me take you back to the web-based browser. It's not just in the supplemental view, so maybe I can show you also in the regular view. Let's restore default so that we start fresh, and let's start with a different body system. Let's go with eye disorders. So if I open up the eye disorder SOC, and as I'm going through the hierarchy of the different HLGTs and HLTs, let's open up this one because I'm sure this one will have those colors. Once I open the hierarchy until I reach the PT level, did anybody guess why are they all green? Can anybody guess why are they all green? I'm looking at the eye disorder system organ class, but one of the eye disorder classification could be a congenital eye disorder, which is fine. It does belong under eye disorder, but we said that one of the important primary system organ class allocations is whether or not a condition is congenital. So if a condition is congenital, that has to be the primary SOC. So I see all of these PTs with a green box, which I expect to be a green box because they are congenital. And if I click on them, I'm going to see on my term details panel here on the right-hand side that the primary link is the congenital system organ class. The secondary link is eye disorders. Let's do other colors. So let me take you out of the congenital. Let's go into gastrointestinal, for example. What about exocrine, cystic pancreatic? Okay, we have a couple of different boxes here. So I am in the gastrointestinal disorder system organ class, and I am in the HLT, the high level term of cystic pancreatic disorders. So I expect these to be gastrointestinal concepts, medical concepts. But if I click on cystic fibrosis, it has a green box. If I click on cystic fibrosis, I know that green means go. Green means go. You are not on the primary system organ class for this particular preferred term. Why? Because cystic fibrosis is a congenital disorder. So yes, it's a gastrointestinal, but it's a congenital disorder. And cystic fibrosis, if you look under the term details on the right-hand side, has even a third link to the respiratory system organ class because it does affect the respiratory body system. It does cause the bronchospasm and obstruction. The blue box means that this is a multi-axial preferred term. It has more than one link to more than one system organ class, but the one you're on right now, the gastrointestinal, is the primary. So if I click on pancreatic cyst, I'm going to see it has two system organ class links, so it's multi-axial. The primary is the gastrointestinal, the secondary is the neoplasms. And why? Because the neoplasm system organ class does include cysts and polyps in the name of the system organ class. So it does include cysts and polyps. But cysts and polyps are not necessarily cancerous. So even though they are linked to in the neoplasm, they are not the primary link to the neoplasm sock. They're secondary. What about the red boxes? Red box, red means stop. You are on a uniaxial preferred term. There's no other links. So if I click on the pancreatic pseudocyst, the only link is gastrointestinal. So the same colors exist whether you are on the supplemental release or the supplemental or the release view. All right, if you have any follow-up questions, please do come back and I'm happy to revisit. All right, let's talk about the standardized MedDRA queries. So what are standardized MedDRA queries? So we saw how MedDRA helps you group like terms together in the high level terms and the high level grouping terms, but these don't always necessarily give you the comprehensive picture of a specific area of interest. So like we talked about the arrhythmias, if I'm interested in supraventricular arrhythmias, that's fine. I can find my HLGT of arrhythmias and HLT of supraventricular arrhythmias, and I have all of those PTs available to me. But a person investigating whether or not their products is causing supraventricular arrhythmia is not only looking for supraventricular arrhythmia within their data set. Some patients may not report supraventricular arrhythmia. They may report a sign or symptom. They may say, I had a shortness of breath or I fainted. That might be the presenting symptom of the arrhythmia that they're experiencing. Or maybe that what you received in your source data was an ECG output of the arrhythmia and not the diagnosis. So it's not always enough to look at the HLTs and the HLGTs. Even when you're looking at secondary system organ classes, when we talked about that cystic fibrosis, if we only look at the primary listings in their default primary system organ class, I'm going to be looking at it as a congenital disorder. But if I'm interested in gastrointestinal manifestations, I want to look at it in my secondary system organ class. And I can look at my data in both primary and secondary system organ classes, but I might still miss some relevant terms that reside in other system organ classes, not necessarily multiaxial. Some of my source data may include signs and symptoms and diagnosis. I might even have physical findings. I might have lab data or other test data. So what standardized MedDRA queries do, they help you identify cases of interest, regardless of which system organ class they exist in. And the way that these standardized MedDRA queries are created is at the PT level. So when a standardized MedDRA query is created to identify a certain medical condition or an area of interest, it starts with the collection of the relevant preferred terms that are related to that area of interest or that medical question. And it's built on the PT level. But because PTs are the parents who house the LLTs underneath them, I can run my analysis even against the LLT level because the standardized MedDRA queries will include all the LLTs that are subsumed under the PTs I selected for my standardized MedDRA query. How does it work? Okay, I will have information in my database, whether it's my clinical trial database, my safety database, whatever database I have. I will have information in there that was coded to MedDRA. So when it was coded to MedDRA, it now exists in LLT level data in the middle of my screen. So now I have my information, my source information in LLT levels. All of these reports that I'm receiving about lab investigations, of course, not numeric, but qualified lab investigations, test results, procedures that were done, signs and symptoms that the patients complained of, and diagnosis that the doctors sent in. I have all of this information in my LLT level in my database, but I want to see if any of them represent my cardiac arrhythmia. So I create a query that collects all of the relevant preferred terms that talk about cardiac arrhythmia, whether they are signs or symptoms, whether they are procedures or ECG findings or lab investigations, anything like that, diagnosis. I'll have them as a collection in a query, and I'll run that query against my database. And if any of those LLTs are a match to LLTs subsumed under the PTs I selected, I will have a hit. And that's how standardized MedDRA queries work. So let me show you example of SMQ view. If I change my view, I'm back at the my browser, and if I change my view from system organ class to SMQ, these are my SMQs. And there's about 110 so far level 1 SMQs. It's a large selection of SMQs. If I look at, for example, let's look at acute renal failure. If I expand the SMQ of acute renal failure, I'm going to see a multitude of different preferred terms. There's, for example, ones in blue and ones in red, and those distinctions we cover in the data analysis webinars. But basically, if it's blue, then it's highly specific to that condition. If it's red, it's sensitive, so it's broad, but it may or may not be specific to the renal failure. So for example, if I have acute kidney injury, that's very specific to acute renal failure. And on my right-hand side of my term details, it will tell me which is my primary system organ class. It's a renal disorder, so it's a medical condition. If I put dialysis is not a condition, it's a procedure. So it goes under the surgical and medical procedures, but it's grouped under my very specific terms, because if somebody had dialysis, it's very likely that they had renal failure. The same, for example, oliguria, peritoneal dialysis, all of these are very specific to the renal failure. But if I had somebody with a blood urea abnormal, it may or may not be an acute kidney failure, but maybe I'm interested in it and maybe not. I mean, it could be so broad that it's just a lot of noise when I look at my data, but it might be relevant. So I have the option when I run these queries against my data to only run them against my narrow scope, which are the blue, or my broad scope, which is everything. And that's something we touch base in more details in the SMQ webinar. So there is a webinar dedicated specifically to talk about SMQs, but this helps you understand how SMQs work. Okay, the ICH also provides us with ICH endorsed guidelines for data retrieval and presentation. So it's very useful for analysis with MedDRA. It's in the same location as the other PTC document where I showed you. And of course, it is also intended as the basis for the organization-specific data retrieval conventions. So this is these are the level 110 SMQs that are in production as of version 28. And as you can see, these are all maybe negative outcomes. You don't want to see these in association with use of your product. So it's very important to identify whether or not there's a safety question at play in use of your medical product. Of course, there are benefits and limitations. The benefits is that you can apply the same standardized MedDRA query regardless of the therapeutic area or the product. So they're validated. They are created by the MSSO physicians. Every time there's a new terms added to MedDRA, the MSSO physicians will decide whether any of these new terms belong to any of these existing 110 SMQs. So it's validated means it's reusable. It's standardized. So when you share safety information with regulators or with your colleagues or different partner organizations, you know what the PTs are if you tell them I use the following SMQ. It's consistent data retrieval, and the maintenance is taken care of by the MSSO and JMO colleagues. But there are limitations. They don't cover all possible medical topics that you could possibly be interested in. And when these SMQs are created by the MSSO, even though they are tested on databases available to the expert working groups, Once they are released and developed and out there for MedDRA users may come back and say, by the way, we recommend you add the following PTs, or that you remove the following PTs, or maybe the following PTs should not be broad, they should be actually narrow scope. So those kind of changes happen after SMQs are released, so they do evolve. But I'll tell you something, SMQs are very useful in understanding the safety profile of your products, and they are being used by regulators worldwide. So if you are working on products that are used in the human population and you don't apply SMQs, just bear in mind that the regulators will likely apply SMQs against your data, and you don't want to find surprising requests coming back from the regulator because they ran SMQs and you did not. But how best to apply the SMQs really depends on how much information you know about your product and what level or what stage you are in your clinical development. So if you're at the stage in clinical trials where you're maybe don't have yet a full safety profile established of your product, you can use multiple SMQs routinely as screening to see, am I getting hits for renal issues or renal SMQs or hypersensitivity SMQ? Am I getting any hits there? Or if you already know that this particular product belongs to a class, a certain class, and they have a specific class effect, or you have preclinical data, you can select the SMQs that are relevant to that class effect or preclinical data. In the post-marketing stage, you can select SMQs that match any known or suspected safety issue, or you can use them as signal detection by using multiple SMQs again across the entirety of your data. Single case alerts basically means the following, and it depends on whether or not your safety database is set up for those kind of notifications. Let's say you already know that your product had previous safety reports of acute pancreatitis. You're continuing to collect data and you want to be made aware as soon as something comes in. You can talk to your IT folks and see if you can set up an alert notification from your safety database as soon as you have a term coded to any of the LLTs that belong under the SMQ of acute pancreatitis. So that may be an option to you. SMQs are also used in periodic reporting, for safety case aggregation and other issues. All right, so this kind of wraps up the presentation of what is MedDRA, how is it used. We did go over the background information about MedDRA, its scope, its structure, its maintenance, the tools we provide. We showed you a little bit of a demo on coding with MedDRA, where to find the points to consider documents, and what exactly are SMQs. We do have links available to you on the slides if you'd like to reach out to the MSSO help desk, or links to the two browsers, the web-based browsers, the desktop browsers, and the mobile browser. And of course, the link to the web-based change request, submissions, our future training schedules, and support documentation. I'll open it up now for Q&A. I know we're very close to the top of the hour, so if folks do need to drop off, thank you so much for your time today. I will stay on. Hannah, if anybody has any questions, I'll be staying on.
Great. Our first question asks, someone creating a data capturing system, how do they use this website structure? Do you have an example?
Data capturing systems are really a broad construct. So data capture, it has so many different modalities. I mean, you can have single source data acquisition models, you have dual sourced acquisition models. So MedDRA does not speak to the data capture models. That's really an internal conversation that you can have within your organization to determine how you're creating your standardized fields, what type of information you are collecting. Are you unifying the data source between your clinical teams and your safety teams, or is each one receiving their source data separately and then you're doing reconciliation? So that kind of construct is really beyond the MedDRA. But in terms of the impact on MedDRA, one of the crucial questions you do need to discuss when you're talking internally about data capture models is whether or not you're able to assign more than one LLT to your source verbatim, or is it a one-to-one correlation? Because if you receive information from your source and it cannot be represented by a single LLT, like that example of the patient took the wrong medication and developed hypertension. So you have bits of information that cannot be captured by a single LLT. That's one thing to think about when you're deciding on data capture models, because if you're unable to assign more than one LLT in your model, you may want to consider what are the options then. Do we send a query to the submitter and ask them to split up this into two different terms and resend, or do you have an internal mechanism to be able to assign all the relevant LLTs? Any other questions?
Our next question asks, what does it mean when the new browser gives me two socks, but one of the socks is in a blue box? Which one should I consider?
The blue box for the system organ classes, the blue box is the primary predefined system organ class. You cannot change it. I mean, you don't need to consider it. You cannot change it. It's the way it was decided upon by the medical officers or the physicians in the MSSO group when they decided to add that term to MedDRA. But it gives you a good idea to know how your data is going to look like when you output it. So if you're looking at, like we said, that cystic fibrosis, in your data output listings, if you're looking at primary default system organ class, which most people do when they look at first data output, they look at primary system organ class as defaulted. They're going to see it as a congenital term. You can still see it as a gastrointestinal term if you retrieve your data inclusive of your secondary system organ class. So you don't really decide on the system organ class which one you want as primary. That choice is made for you. And like we said, please don't ever change it. Any other questions?
Wonderful. Our next question asks, during data entry and case processing, based on the case information or the source article for literature cases, the appropriate PT is selected. Should the access linked to the primary SOC always be selected, or should the choice depend on the case information as a best practice?
Okay, so when hopefully you get a chance to take a look at the PTC guidance document for term selection, it advises you to always be guided by your verbatim, your source verbatim. So whatever information you are receiving from your source, whether your source is a physician or a coordinator or a patient or a caregiver, or it's social websites or whatever your source is, that is what guides you to make your selection at the LLT level. So you're coding to the LLT level and you're trying to find an LLT that exists in MedDRA that is the closest one possible to the source you received. So that's your guiding principle. Now, you're not going to change the system organ class once you select your LLT. The LLT links to the hierarchy as a predefined structure created by the MSSO. Your job when you're coding is you're selecting the LLT that is the closest possible match to your source, whatever your source is that you received. Any other questions?
Fantastic. It looks like that was our last question.
Okay, very good. All right, so I do thank you all for your time today. And if there are more questions or interest about specific coding principles and coding guidelines, like I said, we are presenting, and let me show you where you can find it. We are going to be presenting, no, I want the page. Okay, if you click on our meddra.org website and you click on the calendar, this tab under webinars will show you what's the upcoming webinars. You can collect by either filter by the exact course you're looking for or by the language, and you can see what's coming up. So for example, on 22nd January, we have MedDRA Coding Basics. If you're interested with data analysis, we have that coming up on the 5th of February. We also have webinar on SMQs, specific to SMQs, on 12th of February. For those who like to do hands-on coding, we have a Let's Code Together on the 15th of January coming up, and I don't know, no, we don't have any seats available. These usually go away, get taken up very quickly, but there's a lot of them being offered. So a good resource for you are these upcoming webinars. We also have the YouTube channel, so let's just give you a quick idea where to go. Under training curriculum, it's a nice roadmap of how to become more and more experienced in MedDRA, how to start, how to get more familiar with basics in coding, advanced topics in coding, and then move on to data retrieval and analysis. And it will give you links to webinars, a link to our YouTube channel, our videos available to you, and of course the learning management system. And the learning management system is really helpful because it gives you these options of self-paced training that you can create your accounts as MedDRA users. You can actually go into the LMS and you can choose certificates tracks that allow you to earn a certificate. So if you're a student, if you are an employee and you'd like to show that you trained yourself on coding with MedDRA or introduction to MedDRA or advanced coding, you can actually choose a track that has a certificate and complete it and show that to your supervisor. So we have a lot of options available to you for additional training. But thank you so much for your time today. I do appreciate everyone staying on to the end, and I hope to see you in our next webinars. Have a great day.